Okay.
She
Well,
is Dina, right? Yes, she is Dina. There is no doubt.
Hello from Cape Town, South Africa.
thank you.
Hello.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. We're going to give folks just a few, like just another minute or so to join in, and then we're going to go ahead and get started. Um, Thank you for joining us today and taking the time. Okay, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Natalie Roberts with Scrum Training Institute, and again, I would like to welcome you to our webinar today, which is actually Descaling with LeSS, presented by Cesario Ramos. And we're so blessed to have him. He's such a wonderful trainer, and definitely, you know, he's on that side of, he won't like me saying this, but an expert in LeSS, and just wonderful that we have him here to train with us today and to share some information with you during this webinar. We're going to go ahead and go through some housekeeping items here in a second. The first item before we get started is, if you wouldn't mind, please making sure that you do stay on mute for the webinar. We are going to have time at the end of the presentation for some questions. So if you do have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to place those in the chat down at the bottom of your window, down in your Zoom window. And your mute settings are in the lower left. So as I've got displayed here in the slide, as long as you have the line through your mute, you know that you are muted. So that would be wonderful to help us out with that. And we are recording this webinar, so everyone will have access to the recording after. We'll send the link out for that. And in addition, if there were folks that were not able to join us today, they will be sent the link as well. So without further delay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And while Cesario gets his queued up, again, I'd like to welcome him as one of our trainers with Scrum Institute, and he teaches our LeSS Basics class. And him and Jens have trained together a number of times, and we're so happy to have you, Cesario. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you for introducing. Hello, everybody. I'm in Lisbon, Europe. So for me, it's almost dinner time. Today, I'm going to share with you 50 minutes or so about LeSS and maybe explain also why it is a descaling framework rather than a scaling framework. And we're going to look at LeSS a little bit through the lens of the product owner and through the lens of the product definition. Because product definition is a essential step in any large scale Scrum adoption. So let's get started. So if you work on one product, this is a key rule actually, with more than 5 teams, then LeSS is going to start being useful for you. So if you work with 1 or 2 teams on one product, then you basically cannot do that much wrong actually. by just applying single team Scrum with 2 or 3 teams. But the problems that occur, the problems that emerge when you go to 5, 10, 20, 40 teams, all developing one product, these typical problems are addressed with LeSS. And the question then becomes, as this scope of work gets larger, the product maybe gets larger, the service gets larger, and a few teams are not sufficient anymore. The question often becomes, okay, how can you scale? And maybe it's a trick question to ask, how can you scale? Agile in this case, or Scrum, how can you scale that in the big complex organization that you currently work in? If you take a look at the question of scaling, there are a couple of positions you can take, one position would be that you consider that the Scrum framework is a team level process only. So it's a framework for creating a process for a single team. And while you start adding, while you start scaling and adding more and more teams, the question you want to answer is, so what do I need to add to Scrum, to single team Scrum, so that it can work, it can fit inside my bigger complex organization? So this is a position you can take, and there are frameworks and methods in the market that actually answer that question, where they consider the Scrum framework a team level framework only. But there's another option you can take, another position you can take, and that is you consider that Scrum itself is a complete framework for the complete product development process. And now the question becomes not what do I need to add to Scrum to make it work, but the question becomes, how can I apply all the good things that we know from single team Scrum and have all those good things, but now at scale, now with 30, 40 teams? This is a very different question than question option 1. And this is the question that LeSS tries to address. So how can we get all the good stuff from single team Scrum at a larger scale? So what I want to do is I want to give you a slight, quick overview of what happens if you do option 1, and then we'll delve into option 2 and see it from the product and product owner perspective. So if you consider Scrum a team level process only, then what usually happens is what I call copy paste scaling. You might have some layers of hierarchy, and maybe 5, maybe 6, maybe 3, doesn't really matter. But at some level, there are units, maybe teams or components or applications or, for example, marketing or legal or UX. And because you consider Scrum a team level process only, the idea is then to have all these teams do Scrum, as we know from the Scrum Guide, for example. And that usually means that you copy paste Scrum across all these teams. And what will happen is that you will introduce a lot of product owners because, well, a Scrum team has a product owner and I have 23 teams, so maybe I need 23 product owners. And of course, with these product owners comes some things called product backlogs. So we end up with all these product backlogs. As a result of this, people will consider all these individual components, all these individual functions here to be products, because they have a product owner and a product backlog. But the result could be that what usually happens is if some kind of feature, some kind of functionality needs to be delivered, let's say this is the top one, the red one, then more than one team, usually a couple of teams, need to do work in order to complete this end-to-end feature, this end-to-end piece of functionality. This is where the copy-paste scaling approach starts to break down, because the next one, let's say the yellow one, we also want to do that one. And well, darn, the yellow one needs marketing, it needs Java to do something, for example, it needs the calculator component to do something, and it needs Siebel to do something, for example. But darn, Siebel was already at full capacity working on the red part, the part of the red feature, so they cannot pick up the yellow part. So this yellow part that Siebel has to do, well, needs to be done later. It needs to be managed, maybe. People will need to track it and so on. And because of the mere scale of it, this does not happen with one feature. This happens with a lot of features, for example. It also can happen with the green one, but the green one requires, for example, iOS and web, and also, in this case, the calculator engine. But darn, calculator engine is already full capacity with the red and the yellow part. So again, a little piece of work that becomes in progress, which starts to be delivered out of order compared to the other teams. And what usually happens then is, well, we need to add something to Scrum because Scrum is a team level process. So what you usually see is that some special coordination roles are added. Maybe these are project managers, or maybe these are called feature owners, or maybe these are called I don't know, coordinators, but some kind of coordination role is added just to keep track of all these pieces of work that start being processed out of sync with each other because of this work that does not distribute evenly among all these different parts. As you can see in this particular situation, we don't have anything to do yet for Portal. You see, Portal doesn't have anything. Authentication in the middle doesn't have anything. UX doesn't have anything. So we need to find something for them to do. And it's not, it could be that the next feature, the one below green, also does not contain work for these three teams. So what usually happens is that we will go down the product backlog looking for work just to keep the other teams also busy. And maybe you will end up with, let's say, item 18 or item 21 or item 44 on the overall portfolio, let's say, or the overall product backlog, just to fill, to keep Portal in this case and legal busy. But of course, it's also possible that for that black feature, Siebel needs to do something, for example, but darn, of course, Siebel was already busy. So this really starts to be messy and coordination, etc., would need to be added and so on. So copy-paste scaling is very likely to result in these dynamics. And then we have to answer also some questions at the overall level. At the overall level of adding value, requiring multiple teams most of the times, it's hard to measure progress at that level. It's hard to manage the dependency, so we have to add things to do that. We have to add things to measure progress. We can ask the question, so how do we know that a feature needs to be done by team A, B, C, and D? How is that determined, right? Who will do the analysis of that? Who will do the architecture of that? Who will do the end-to-end testing? So all these cross-cutting concerns need to be addressed. And usually this is done by adding more stuff to single team Scrum. So each of these teams might have their own burn down if they use that technique. So this needs to be added and combined. Maybe there was a tool like Jira, or maybe there is a PMO, that support function that combines all these statistics into one, adding complexity, adding process. And of course, we then need to manage the dependencies. Well, maybe we'll have Scrum Masters do that, manage dependencies, or maybe the team product owners can do that, manage dependencies. And we have to take care of testing and architecture and so on. So single function groups are introduced. And if they do Scrum, they of course would have their own product backlog, their own product owner and so on. And all these things are added to single team Scrum. And you can imagine that this is what at least in Europe happens all the time when you scale Scrum inside your current overly complex organization by adding stuff. So option one, actually more often than not in my experience, will slow you down rather than speeding up. And that is because we have this narrow product definition. We actually think of that all these parts are a product, but they are not. They are product parts. And because of that, it's very hard to have a focus on the end customer, very hard to have a focus on end-to-end features. So metrics would be output-based, would be activity-based, which could be good, but it's not the thing we want in an agile, adaptable organization. The key is here that the key idea is that actually all these teams are locally optimizing. They're doing what's best from an efficiency point, what's best for them locally. So, so option two is about saying, okay, maybe it's not, the position is, so we don't have to add anything to Scrum. Scrum itself is enough for the whole product process, product development process. And instead of asking the question, what do we add? We ask the question, why are certain events, why are certain artifacts, etc., in Scrum? And how can we ensure that they serve the same purpose, but now with 20 teams, right? For example, how can we keep a customer focus with 20 teams? So how can we keep each team working on value for an end customer? So how can we actually do that? And that's what LeSS tries to address. It's based on the concept of Scrum, which is well, the thing I like the most about single team Scrum is that you can give this self-managing team a problem, and they then take ownership of that problem and they actually solve it end to end. This characteristic is a essential characteristic, I think, in single team Scrum. And in multiple team Scrum, so not multiple Scrum teams, but multiple team Scrum, if you have 20 teams, it would be perfect, it would be excellent if you couldn't give any problem that we need to fix from a product perspective to any of the teams, and they could fix it end to end. That would give us maximum flexibility, maximum agility. So this is a thing that LeSS takes into account, to have this essence of single team Scrum, but over all the teams that are there. And a key starting point is to understand and to study and identify what is the product. So it's not UX, it's not marketing, it's not Siebel, it's something else. It's a combination of those. And unless we like to see a product from the outside in, so we don't want to think that technology is a product. No, we want to think what is the needs and what are the problems that we want to solve, we want to satisfy for key users. and with what kind of features or functionality are we going to satisfy those needs. So a product must have some kind of real users, provide some kind of features, and it must have some kind of business model, some kind of some way to make money of it, so that these users are willing to pay money for having their needs addressed. And the organizational elements, such as teams, that are able to realize this complete set of features that a user is willing to pay for, that is our starting point. That is what we start with in LS adoption. So we have that as a product definition, and then organize around that. In single team Scrum, it's obvious you only have one team, so they address the whole product. But in multiple team Scrum, this is a bit harder. So we start by defining what the product is. And there are many ways to define it. I think an example could be useful. So this is from the same customer that I shared just in the slides with all the backlogs popping up and so on. And this is just a part of the organizational elements. So I took out of legal and so on. So these are teams, maybe more. There's maybe more than one portal team. Maybe there are a couple of ESB teams, Salesforce teams, etc. And this was around 17 or 18 of these different groups, but I'm just showing 6 here. So to find the product, we do it outside in. So we would have workshops, etc., with marketing and with sales and with product management and with architecture, etc., to identify key users, right? So let's say we would identify these three key users. And then we would say, we would study and say, okay, hey users, what is the needs that you want addressed? What problems do we solve for you? And which features actually do you consume in order for that to happen? And we would get a number of features, maybe features that we developed last year, or maybe features we are expecting to deliver in the coming year. And we use those features to study and see how those features play out in the current organizational design. And for this example, let's say we identified a couple of features, green features and red features and yellow features. And then the question would be, so if we are developing this yellow feature that you can see in the right top of your corner of your screen, so which of these teams would need to do something, change code, configure stuff, etc. So we would say, you could, for example, discover that, well, these teams all need to do something in order to deliver this feature end to end. And then you can continue with a second feature, like, for example, the green feature. Well, for the green feature, Siebel, App, ESB, and Salesforce needs to do something. And you can continue doing that with a couple of features, maybe 50 features or so. And noting, administering which of the teams are used. And eventually, you will discover that some of these teams, some of these applications, some of these components, some of these functions that are in your organizational design are used more often than others. Some are used more often than others. And this is an interesting observation. For example, you could discover that Salesforce, ESB, and Siebel, well, these three groups are used 90% of the time. So 90% of the time when we want to ship an end-to-end feature, these three groups need to do something, right? In practice, it would be these 17 teams need to do something, or these 28 teams need to do something. But let's say it's just for these three teams in this example. And this means something. So this could mean that, well, maybe these are not, Salesforce, Siebel, and ESB are not separate products. Maybe the reason that they are used together all the time, they need to do something together all the time, it's because they are part of the same product. So we would then say in LeSS, well, maybe we should consider having teams, we call them feature teams or Scrum teams, that cover Salesforce, ESB, and Siebel. That would give us speed and adaptability. And maybe if the teams still have are comfortable, they should can also add portal maybe, or app, or both. All right, right from the start. And the broader this product definition, in this case, only seen from internal view at this moment, the broader it gets, the more cross-functional and cross-component your teams get, and the more adaptable your organization becomes at the product level. So in LeSS, we like to define our product as broad, as practical, and we like to then, if we cannot define it as if we cannot have all the teams include all the function, all the components right from the start, then we start with the components that we need the most, and then expand as time progresses. But in this case, we would like to start with the components that heat up the most, so that we can still have feature teams, just like in single team Scrum, which can solve problems for the end customer. And this also means that as the product definition becomes broader and broader, that a question needs to be addressed: what to do with all these team product owners? I just call them product part owners. So if you have 8 teams, or if you have 30 teams, which is more often the case in my customers, you would have 80 or you would have 30 or product part owners. So what will all these product part owners do all day long, right? Usually what they do in copy-paste scaling is, well, maybe they write user stories. Wow, not very useful. Maybe they act as in-betweens between the customer and the teams. Because no customer wants to talk to the Java team. Why should the customer talk to the Java team, right? Or to the database team? Very unlikely. Maybe they do all kinds of coordination work for the teams, taking away the responsibility of coordination from the teams, dumbing them down actually. So they will do all of this extra stuff, extra activity, which is often not useful from a Scrum team perspective. And usually it's because there were team leaders, or there were business analysts, or let's just call them intermediates, and they would talk to users and create requirements and then hand them off to developers. And the only thing that we did was change their titles to product part owners. So they still talk to the users, but now they don't write requirements, they write stories. It's just the same, just in a funny format maybe, and then hand them off to the developer. So we don't want that. So what we do in LeSS is, as the product definition gets broader and broader, the features that are being developed get closer and closer to real end users. They get closer and closer to what a business model actually wants. What we do with these product part owners is we eliminate that role, and we promote these product part owners. We give them promotion so they can now become a full-time development team member. Just like a tester and a programmer, we also need business analysis skills. So they are added to the team so they can now have lunch with the team also, and don't need to sit alone at the table anymore with the other product part owners. We then let these teams, which now include business analysis skills, clarify or detail product backlog items directly with the users, instead of via the in-between. And this brings us to the LeSS framework, which is up to 8 teams or so. One product, up to 8 teams, one product owner, of course, and they all work off the same product backlog, and they all deliver work in a shared code environment and deliver one product at the end of the sprint, one increment at the end of the sprint. So no more fake product owners, as we call them in LeSS. And that means that the product owner role becomes more strategic. They are no longer, let's say, spoon feeding the teams with requirements and so on. No, they have a focus on understanding the market, understanding customer needs, and so on, and using that information to determine the order of delivery of increments. And what they then do is they match the team with certain external or internal customers or users, and then let the team clarify directly with the customers instead of the product owner doing that. So the product owner now has time free to do much more important stuff, to use much more of his intellect, which is understanding the market and acting more at the strategic level. So unless the product owner is more about that strategic part, and what we see is, what I see at my customers, a product owner is pretty high in the hierarchy, maybe board -1, sometimes board -2, but in banks and in insurance companies and so on, where I work a lot, a product owner is board -1 most of the time. So it's not a board -7 team manager or something, or product part owner. And he has a lot of work to do, and part of that work is determining what needs to be developed in what sequence. For example, we don't want that person to, in this case, use her intellect on management activities, like line management activities or reporting, or having teams report to her in the sense of a HR reporting relationship, because that would be a waste of her talent. So we want her to be out there at the customers, out there in the market, not in here having meetings internally about management stuff. So all reporting relationships related to HR, etc., it's gone. It's handled via a different route, via a different line management route. And another thing to point out is, now that these teams have a more of a whole product focus, there is no need to have efficiency or output metrics at the team level. They can still have these output, these activity metrics and these efficiency metrics, but then they can use them for what they are supposed to be used for, which is to assess how good the process at the team level is working, and to see if any improvements that they make have an effect on their process. But because these teams now work closer to the end customer, maybe they work directly with the end customer, that's what we want to achieve. It now becomes fair, which was not fair before, but now it's fair and useful and motivating to just use the business KPIs that are already present, of course, but now they also apply to the group and therefore also to the teams. So that's a very important thing that becomes possible now. We can move now to outcome metrics and have that also be a responsibility of the teams, because they actually can influence it now. If you go above these 8 teams, then what usually happens is that a single product owner will have a hard time understanding in detail the market, and teams will have a hard time also to cover the vast amount of maybe technologies or skills, etc. And what we do then is what we call less huge. This picture here is from a bank in Holland, and it's 24 teams, as you can see. And what usually happens is, if you have such a big system, such a big product, you usually have a lot of users also. And if you ask these users, hey users, where would you spend most of your time when you consume our product? If you ask that to a diverse set of users, from my experience, what always happens is that only a very few users will say, well, I use all the 1,000 features that you offer. Very rarely do I see that happening. What I most often see happening is that users will identify parts of the big product that they use most of the time. You can identify segments of users, and each segment of users spends most of their time in an area of functionality of the product. For example, it could be, if this is a banking product, so there would be a set of users that they would consume most of the time, features that are related to risk management. So can I apply, shall we give the loan to this guy? How is his financial status, et cetera, et cetera. They consume very different features than an end user who would be applying for the loan, and so on. And that's what we see here. When we did that study, we identified 30, 40 features. We said, hey, who is consuming these features most of the time? And then we said, okay, if we have to develop these features, which teams would need to do something for these features? We identified actually 3 areas, as you can see. They're just called blue, orange, and gray here. But for example, if we take a look at the blue area, what this states is that there is a segment of users that spend most of their time using features. We call them the blue area. And when we developed those features, we did this on historical features, then it turned out that team 1, 2, 3, 4, 21, 6, and 7 would be needed 100% of the time. For each of these features, these teams need to do something, change something, configure something, program something, etc. And the same thing for gray. Some teams, for example, team 24, well, they are 50-50. This means that, 50% of the time, the blue area needs to have skills related to whatever team 24 is specialized in. And 50% of the time, the orange area also needs the same skill. So this would be a shared function or a shared component. But the point is, if you look at from the customer perspective in a large product, you usually identify these areas. And then we can use these areas to reduce the cognitive load on the teams by splitting off these areas, and we call them value areas. And then we can still have teams who work in these value areas, deliver end-to-end features. Because they just do it for a customer segment of the product. And the same is true for the gray one and the orange one. And what we are then talking about is this second framework, which is a necessary evil, because we are siloing, but we're siloing at least from the customer perspective, and at least every team is an end-to-end feature team. In this case, we see a less huge configuration with 3 areas, which is exactly the example I gave in the slide before. And because the PO now normally cannot comprehend such a big market, he needs lots of help. He prefers, of course, to have help from the teams, for example, in clarification and doing type of testing, UX testing, and so on. But he also needs help in product ownership. If you can see in this case, it's 3 areas. They all work in a synchronized sprint. The 3 areas have 3 sprint plannings, but they all start at the same time. And so this product owner can only be present at one of those 3. So he needs help. And that's where we introduce these helpers called area product owners, these guys and ladies that you can see here on the left. So from a perspective of option 2, it is about thinking from the outside in, moving away from this copy-based scaling, moving away from thinking technology or function, and then how can we relate it to the customer, which is very hard, very unlikely to happen, because teams are far, far, far away from the end customer if they are working on a product part. The feedback loop about the whole product is very long, so learning takes a lot of time. The decision horizon, they can make decisions, such a product part team, that affects 15 teams, team 16, which is far, far away from them, later, and then before they understand what's going on, weeks, or in my experience, months could have passed. So learning is very hard in this case. So option 2 promotes thinking from the customer needs, and then to technology, and then organizing and designing your organization from that perspective, so that you optimize for flexibility at customer demand. And then you organize around the features, and you organize around, you create these cross-component, cross-functional teams that are able to execute on the work that comes in from outside. So I see that I'm arriving at my last slide. So we go from outputs to outcomes, actually, in option 2, by defining the product as broad as practical from the start, identifying the users, studying how the work works, identifying which of the organizational elements are needed the most, and then you organize for those first, and then you will try to add the other ones later if you cannot not add them right from the start. You can now work and use at the product level actionable outcome metrics like engagement, adoption, retention, market growth, etc. And you do not have to steer anymore on the activity metrics, which are useless if you have 23, or if you have 23 teams, for example, for forecasting, for example. You have to combine all these statistically biased measures into one burn down, for example, which is very hard to get any meaningful data from. So yes, to close, so design your organization from the outside in, define your product as broad as practical, and expand your product definition as time goes on until you reach the limits of the cognitive capacity of your teams. And when you reach that, the only thing you still can do is reduce the complexity of your landscape by merging, or by choosing for fewer sets of technologies. And if it's a software product, you can also gain some space, some intellectual space by automation, for example. The more you automate, the easier it gets for folks to do stuff, the less details they need to remember. So that's also an option you can consider to expand your product definition. Yes. So I think that brings my talk to an end. Couple of minutes short. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Cesario. We do have a couple questions out here in chat. So it'd be wonderful to take a couple minutes on those. And if anyone else would like to submit your questions as well, we do have some time. So that would be great. The first question we have is regarding effectiveness in number of teams. So the question is the LeSS framework specifically for 5 to 8 teams? Is it maybe not as effective for less than 5 teams or more than 8 teams?
If you only have a couple of teams, 2, 3 teams, then the problems that you can get into are not addressed by LeSS. The problems you can get into, you can probably likely just solve by applying single team Scrum that we know from the Scrum guide. The work being chopped up in pieces, the work being injected into your organizational system out of order, and then the additional roles you need to introduce for that, the additional processes you need to introduce, the single team functions like the testing team and the business analysis team and so on. Those things apply and become a problem the more teams you have. So that's why we have this rule. If you have, well, fewer than 5 teams, 3 teams or so, well, there's nothing that much that can go wrong if you do single team Scrum. So the more teams you have, the more benefit you will have from applying LeSS and this broader product definition and these cross-component, cross-functional teams. Now, if you go over 8, 9 teams and you get into this less huge, it's very effective still compared to copy-paste scaling, you see, but it's not as brilliant, it's not as effective as up to 8 teams, because you have this necessary division of your teams. So if you have 24 teams, you could have 3 areas, let's say, with each 8 teams. So these each team in each area would be an end-to-end feature team, but they can only work in their specific value area. So when, for example, in one area the work starts to dry up because the product owner decides to move somewhere else and invest somewhere else, then these teams would need to be moved as the whole team to that new area or to a existing area. And they would need to do some learning, of course. Maybe they will need to learn a couple of new technologies. Maybe they need to learn a little bit about the domain. But it's not the same as working totally siloed in a component or something. They already work in the same sprint. They already work on the same product for all that time. So this tends to be an easier thing to do.
Great, thank you. A couple other questions. What is the main difference between LeSS and SAFe?
Okay, so I'm not very happy with questions about SAFe because it's easy to say bad things about other frameworks, which I don't like. But in my opinion, a big difference is that you have, in SAFe, you probably have copy-paste scaling at the bottom. So each team at the bottom, as far as I know, and that's big SAFe graphic, are just Scrum teams. But it's very unlikely that these Scrum teams actually deliver a product. What they do very likely is they deliver product parts. So you would have all these dynamics, these negative dynamics that I showed when I was talking about copy-paste scale. So they would add stuff to Scrum, which they do, if you look at SAFe. So I think that's the main difference. I think LeSS tries to, LeSS will redesign your organization so that it optimizes for adaptability first, and second, it optimizes for learning, so the teams can learn fast. So the feedback loop must be short, so they must have a as broad as practical focus on the product so they can learn faster. I don't think if you do copy-paste scaling, which maybe SAFe does, you have the same effect in SAFe. Another thing maybe that could be a difference is that SAFe optimizes for program execution, which is okay, it's no problem for that, while LeSS optimizes for flexibility. Another difference might be if you look at the origins, LeSS was created in the context of large products which have lifespans of 20, 30 years. So need to be supported. So it's for a long time, long-lived products, long-lived service level agreements and so on. So it's worth investing and it's worth addressing root causes. And as far as I know, SAFe was developed for short-term products like phones and so on, where maybe investing in long-term solutions, long-term solving of root causes is not maybe very appealing.
Great. When is the best time to make the assessment to bring teams together? During the planning increment or as soon as you identify the overlap?
So I'm not really understanding the question, so I'm trying to imagine what the question is. So, and my customers, when they call me in, they are already doing Scrum for lots of years, and what they do is copy-paste scaling when they come in, and they have all these problems like, well, we have long release cycles. Well, we cannot. I have all these teams in my group, in my division, and when I want to go left, well, 50% of the teams cannot react because they only know a little part of the product, so they will need to work on something else, and so on. So they have these problems, and one of the things that then needs to be done is to understand and study what the product is and which of these organizational elements are part of the product definition. So once you understand that, which organizational elements are part of the product definition, meaning they are needed most of the time to deliver end-to-end features, team 1 until 20, they are needed 90% of the time. So if that is the case, well, then these 19 teams need to work together in LeSS. So what you would do is you would eliminate all these teams, put all the people into a big room and say, hey, these are features which are end-to-end features. This is the definition of done, so you have to do all these activities also. Now let's self-organize into teams who can actually pick up a feature and deliver it according to the definition of done. And then because nobody got fired, all the skills are still there, all the IQ is still here, all the people are still here. What this boils down to is a reconfiguration of the teams, from single component teams to cross-component teams, from single function team to cross-functional teams. And once you have that, then it's just Scrum. They have a sprint planning, et cetera, just like in single team Scrum, but it's all together.
Great. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Will the development team members remain the same for all sprints? Do they shuffle within the sprint or after each sprint as per feature need?
No, unless we prefer to have stable teams, long-lived teams. So we prefer not to shuffle them. And there are a couple of reasons for that. For example, if we know that teams take some time, it takes around a year and a half on average, at least from the studies I know, for a team to grow, if they achieve it, from a group to a effective team. Okay, that's what the research tells us. Takes a year and a half. So if you keep reconfiguring the teams, what can happen, and usually happens, is that they need to start all over again to bond and to create healthy dynamics and to find their position and so on. So that's one reason we don't want to shift all the people around. Second is we want teams, just like in single team Scrum, to own their process and to create their own process. And if I already know that in 2 weeks I will not be working with Jens anymore and with Dina and so on, why should I care about my process? Why should I care in creating a effective relationship business-wise with them if I will be working with somebody else in 2 weeks? And so that's also a reason we don't prefer to shift team membership. So we prefer to have long-lived, stable teams so they can grow into high performance and keep them there. And on average, they can stay there for 3 years, and then they start to bore each other, and then it's time to reshuffle. It's like having the same yogurt. I use the example of the same yogurt every day, and it gets boring. You need another type of yogurt.
Yep. Great. We have just a couple minutes left. What I would like to do, we do have a few more questions out there, but before we lose track of time, I would like to ask everyone, if you wouldn't mind, we're going to just launch a really quick 2-question retrospective poll to get your thoughts on the webinar. And Jens, if you're on, that would be great if you could maybe launch it on your side.
Done.
And just maybe let me know once that's launched, because I can't see it on my side.
It is launched.
Okay, great. And if you guys wouldn't mind filling that out, that would be wonderful. And we'll give folks a minute or so to do that. There are, Cesario, I don't know if you can see in the chat, there are a few other questions out there. Maybe,
No.
Okay. While you guys are working on that, just a couple other questions. The decision-making authority. Is the decision-making authority of the PO and APO the same, or who makes the final call?
So one of the principles in LeSS is that large scale Scrum is still Scrum. So if you know single team Scrum, then you know LeSS. So in single team Scrum, we have this product owner who is responsible for product success, and this is still true in LeSS. So the product owner, there's only one product owner, the product owner, and this person decides the order of the product backlog and has all the other characteristics that we know from single team Scrum. So the APOs are just helpers, as I call them, because if you have 30 teams and you have 3 sprint plannings in parallel, then that product owner can only be present at 1, right? Let's say in area 1, and then area 2, 3 need to be represented by an area product owner.
Okay, great. And another question, what is the most common challenge when you start reorganizing teams?
Oh, most common. There are so many challenges. Now it becomes change. So it's about changing. People are, so you can imagine that UX team, for example, it's there for a reason. As an organizational unit, it probably has a UX team manager, you see, and a UX team product owner, and the team are full of UX people and they like each other. So if you do a less adoption, you're eliminating this UX group. So then, of course, well, the person who is the UX team manager, he will not be very happy, probably. So all that kind of resistance will, that kind of challenge, you will need to address.
Great.
And then, yeah, other things like, so if you eliminate the architecture group, if you just to give a for example, so who will do the architecture now then? The teams will need to do that. So how do you address that, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Great. And then we do have one final question. Thanks everyone for hanging in there. We had a lot of great questions. How do you integrate all these teams, like in the multiple team scenario with Salesforce, EBS, and Siebel? And how many members are on these teams in each of the areas? And how are LeSS teams different from component teams?
Okay, so there's a lot of questions. Let me just start with the last one. So normally, if you do copy-paste scaling, you would have a Siebel Scrum team. And in that Scrum team, there would be only Siebel people. And you would have a, I don't know, what was it? UX team and a Siebel and a Java and a, I don't know, Portal.
EBS and Salesforce, yeah.
So these are all single function teams or component teams or application teams. They come in various names. And they work on a product part most of the time. So a LeSS team, which is a Scrum team, would include skills from UX, Java, Portal, etc. in one team. So the team would be cross-functional and cross-component. And of course, it's Scrum, LeSS is Scrum, so it still would need to be between 3 and more or less 9 people per team.
Gotcha.
So that's where the heads, maybe the cognitive capacity will be stretched. And that's why we have this less huge, so you can specialize, but you specialize in the customer domain instead of in the technology domain.
Great. Awesome. Thank you, Cesario. And it looks like that brings us to the end of our hour plus a couple minutes. I'd like to thank everybody for taking time out of your day to join us today, and definitely would like to thank Cesario again for the wonderful presentation. Thank you all again, and hopefully you'll find some time to join us for some of your for some of our additional webinars that we're offering. Thank you.
Thank you.